Chapter 24, Cost Allocation and Responsibility Accounting, are the topics we're looking at here. We're actually going to look at a little more detail in cost allocation about how to allocate those indirect costs to our production that we have been talking about before. We're going to look at some detailed calculations for those overhead application rates, along with a new topic, responsibility accounting. So as I said, we're going to look at how we move those direct costs, labor and overhead, directly into production, but also how we can calculate these predetermined overhead allocation rates using either a single or multiple allocation bases. We'll also look at something called decentralization and the use of responsibility accounting in that area. We will look at performance evaluation systems such as the balanced scorecard and how these systems can help us to analyze more than just the quantitative or financial side of our organization. We'll also look at some responsibility reports and how we can break down contribution margin a little bit more in depth to truly evaluate a cost, revenue, and a profit center. We'll also look at some new phrases, return on investment and residual income, to give us some idea of how we evaluate investment centers. And then finally, we'll spend a brief amount of time looking at transfer pricing and how this impacts decentralized organizations. So let's begin with learning objective 1, allocating these indirect costs using predetermined allocation rates with both single and multiple allocation bases. So if you remember, as we've been going through the production process, our production costs are made up of a couple of different things, all right? Remember the direct material, directly and easily traceable to our product, the amount of materials that are being moved in, direct labor. So this is the labor that we can trace directly to our product, and then our manufacturing overhead. So the direct materials and direct labor are easy to trace into the production process because we know how much how much material is being used, how much direct labor is being incurred. But it's a little harder when we get to the manufacturing overhead cost. And so we have to use an allocation method to move these costs into production. And we've seen this in prior chapters. This is not new. What will be new are some different methods that we can use to determine what this overhead allocation rate is actually going to be. Now, the rate that we have looked at so far is the single plant-wide rate. So we're simply using one cost driver to determine what is moving our overhead cost. And it's called the traditional approach of allocating manufacturing overhead. It's the simplest method that's out there. And as I said, we're using one allocation base. We're assuming that our manufacturing overhead is being driven by machine hours or direct labor hours or direct labor cost. And so regardless of the different departments that we have and the different products that we have, we're simply using that one driver to allocate our estimated overhead. And so this shouldn't be new to you. Remember, we've talked about how to calculate this predetermined overhead allocation rate. Remember, we are estimating the amount of overhead that we think we will incur in the next period. We're trying to budget for what's going to take place in the next period. And so we look at the actual overhead that we have incurred in the past, and we estimate any increases or decreases in that overhead to come up with what we think our estimated overhead cost will be for this period. Then we estimate something else. We estimate what your book calls an allocation base or a cost driver. What is driving the overhead cost in our formula? And so in the examples that we've seen so far, we've used direct labor costs, direct labor dollars, machine hours. And so if we're using direct labor cost, let's just refresh. What do we mean by 40% of direct labor cost as our allocation base? We are saying that for every dollar I spend in direct labor, not hours, dollars. For every dollar that I spend in direct labor, I'm incurring 40 cents of manufacturing overhead. So when I generate payroll, I can take my payroll for my direct labor hours, multiply it times 40%, and that's what gets moved into work in process for manufacturing overhead. Now, ideally, it would be better to know exactly how much we're spending in manufacturing overhead and allocate the exact amounts as production is taking place. But we don't know those exact amounts until the end of the period, and we really cannot wait until the end of the period to allocate overhead. So this is our estimate. And so we would use using the single plant-wide rate of 40% of direct labor costs to allocate manufacturing overhead as the production process is taking place. Now, we can also do this using multiple department rates. Instead of just one single rate, we could come up with multiple. So what if we have two departments and they have two different or more allocation bases? So in this example, we've broken it down to say, well, what if we have a production department? And most of the overhead that's taking place there is driven by machine hours. That's what we're doing, producing our product. We're running our machines. But what if in our smart tablets, we also have a software department? And if you think about in software, this is probably driven more by direct labor cost. I have some very skilled people, maybe some less skilled people that are actually working on designing and implementing the software into my smart tablets. And so the overhead that's taking place in that department is probably driven by the amount that I'm spending on direct labor instead of the amount that I am spending on machine hours. Okay, so if we want to more accurately allocate that overhead, then let's find what's truly driving the overhead in those particular departments. Let's see this at work. So let's say that we have our production department and our software department. And if let's see if we back up to a prior screen. Remember, we estimated in your textbook, they've given us an estimate of $100,000 in overhead. And when we used our single plant-wide rate, we came up with a rate of 40% of direct labor cost. I would use this 40% to allocate overhead to both the production and the software departments. But what if we could truly find what's driving the cost, and what if we could truly break our cost pool, that estimated overhead, down into 80,000 of that overhead is related to the production department, 20,000 of that overhead is allocated to the software department. So I can break the 100,000 down into more than one cost pool. And then we've decided that machine hours is driving overhead in the production department, and direct labor cost is driving overhead in the software department. So let's take a look at how many machine hours are taking place. How many do we estimate to take place? And we've estimated 15,000 machine hours for our standard units and 5,000 machine hours for our premium units. So we're estimating 20,000 total machine hours in the production department. In the software department, we have estimated that we will spend 22,000 in labor costs for the standard units and 9,250 in labor costs for the premium unit, for a total of 31,250. So now that I know my total estimated overhead, and now that I know, so we bring that down to both departments, and now that I know the total estimated driver for that department in both scenarios, now I can calculate a new overhead allocation rate. So in the production department, if we run 15,000 machine hours on our standard tablets, 15,000 at $4 a machine hour means that I have 60,000 out of my 80,000, 60,000 of that is going to my standard tablets, and out of that 80,000, 20,000 is going to my premium tablets. So do you see how much more information we have now? I can get more precise on what the real costs are for me in each one of my products, standard and premium. We do the same thing for the direct labor side. We've estimated that there's $20,000 of overhead. We've estimated $31,250 of direct labor cost as our driver, indicating that for every hour, for every dollar that I pay my direct labor people, 64 cents of overhead is taking place. So when we do this allocation, 20,000 of that overhead ends up, out of the 20,000, 14,000 of it ends up in my standard product, and almost 6,000 of it ends up in my premium tablet. So it's a little more precise. We carry this one step further to look at how can we, this helps us to identify what are we trying to do. Estimate what the total cost of my standard model and my premium model are actually going to be. And we already knew the direct materials cost per unit. We already knew the direct labor cost per unit. This is what we were trying to discern. Okay, how much manufacturing overhead do we allocate to each one of these products? So based on our prior calculations of 60,000, remember the 60,000 and 20,000? Our 80,000 has been spread out among the two different models. The 20,000 has been spread out among the two different models as well. So now I know the overhead that's coming from the production department to the standard and the premium, and the overhead that's coming from the software department to the standard and the premium. So now I can estimate my total manufacturing overhead for each product, and I know how many units. Okay, now this is not cost drivers. This is the number of units that I'm actually going to manufacture. So if I know total overhead cost divided by the number of units I'm going to manufacture, now I know my manufacturing overhead cost per unit, and these are the numbers that we can pull down now to try to get an estimate. What kind of estimate? A total cost estimate of what it's going to cost me to make this product. $275 for the standard model, almost $400 to manufacture the premium model. So the more precise I can get these estimated costs, the more precise I can be in benchmarking, the more precise I can be in pricing my product, the more precise I can be in competing with a tight market. Okay, so in our analysis, if we simply used the single plant-wide rate, we allocated $273 of overhead to the standard model. But when we break it down into multiple departments, we should actually be allocating more, $1.84 more per product to the standard model. On the opposite side of that, okay, our single plant-wide rate put $407 into the premium model when truly it's should only be getting $400 worth of overhead allocated to it. Now this might not seem significant, but if I am in a very tight competitive market, if I'm using the single plant-wide rate, I am going to be tempted to overprice my premium model because I think it costs me more to manufacture than it really does. Okay, so the benefit of the multiple department allocation rates is the more cost pools we can identify and the more accurate cost drivers we can identify, the more accurate our allocation of overhead to our products is actually going to be. Now, I know this is a lot of material just to identify the single plant-wide overhead rate and multiple department overhead rates. So I would like for us to take a break in Learning Objective 1 to let you go back and review what we have talked about, and then we're going to come back and look at the third method that we can use in allocating manufacturing overhead, and it is called activity-based costing.